Hi there. So before we move on to our next topic, let's have a quick recap of what we discussed in our last video. So in the last video, we were discussing about the perceptron structure and how the inputs are multiplied to the respective weights and then summed up to provide as an input to our activation function, and then the activation function processes the input or the summed up package, this whole package, and gives an output. So the output is the activation function applied on the summed weighted inputs. So one thing to notice here is the unidirectional weights. The weights that are associated to each of the inputs are always unidirectional, that is, they flow towards the activation function. One more thing about the perceptrons that is very important to understand is that in the biological system as well, a neuron or a cell, nerve cell is triggered or activated only when there is enough electrical signal to activate it. Similarly, in a perceptron as well. Similarly, in the perceptron, we see that a perceptron is able to produce an output only when the weighted inputs, the sum of weighted inputs are sufficient to cross the threshold value of the activation function. So the output of a perceptron will be received only, or a perceptron will be triggered or fired or activated only if there is enough weighted input to trigger it off. Okay, so moving on to our next topic, which is learning, the way it happens in biological neural networks and how it inspired the learning in our artificial neural networks. So we'll be understanding the biological neural networks and the learning that happens through biological neural networks through these four diagrams. And to explain these four diagrams are just they represent the cortex of a human brain as observed at different different age instances. With this first diagram shows the cortex. If you look at the cortex of a newly born child, the brain cortex of a newly born child, what you will see is a few neuron cells that are sparsely distributed across the cortex. They don't have connections built in between them because a newly born child has a very less learning. And as you move further, when the child turns say 6 to 7 years of age, he has learned too many things. He has too many questions. He has too many learnings, like from language to how to live, how to talk, how to behave. All those things happen as learnings. As the learning, to explain what learning is creating connections between the neuron cells. So learning basically is creating a connection between the neuron cells, and how thick the connections established between two neuron cells signifies how strong the connection is built. So say a child, when he was 3 or 4 years of age, he does something very hot. So at that point of time, he got to know it created a lot of pain in his hand, body and mind. And he got to understand that touching hot things is a very painful job. So at that point of time, when the learning will be created, there will be the two neurons that will be connected, or the neuron framework that will be, or the neural network that will be built in his brain cortex will be very thick. That is, he got a very prominent learning. So what happens as the child grows further and enters into his teenage, or when he's about to end his teenage, so his learning is somewhat mature, and proper connection between the neural networks, not haphazard or chaotic like when he was very young. So the proper connections are formed within his brain. So the learning happens through the connections that established between the neurons that are present in the cortex of the brain. So this is basically the third diagram is basically the cortex as seen in a youngster's mind. The fourth diagram or the last diagram, this diagram shows how the degeneration of the connections or the learnings happens as a person turns older. So say someone reached the age of 80 years, so his the connections or the learning that happened, the learning connections that were established between his neuron cells will start deforming, or they'll start getting disconnected, and also the active neuron cells, the density will also decrease. So this is the neural degeneration that happens. So just to understand, so this is the brain cortex of a child at the time of his birth. The second one is, so this is at the time of birth. So the second one is when the child is, say, of 7 to 8 years. This is when the child was of 16 years, and this is say 80 years old. So basically what we got to understand by this explanation is that all biological learning happens through the connections that are established between the neurons. So all biological learning is establishing connections and putting weights on those connections in between the neurons. So these thick ones will have more weight. This connection will have more weight compared to this thin connection. So to conclude, the biological neural networks actually inspired the formation of artificial neural networks in a way that in the artificial neural networks, the neurons were replaced by perceptrons, and an interconnection between the perceptrons was planned upon to reach the desired output. Also, the network that was seen in the biological neural networks was also copied in the artificial neural networks, and the interconnection, whether it should be thick or thin, was signified by the value of the weights that were applied onto each of the connection between the perceptrons. So this is how biological neural networks loosely inspired the artificial neural networks.